right, folks, let's go ahead and get started out there in webinar world. My name is Jeremy Hazel, and I'll be the one kind of taking you through today's webinar. Now, I did want to kind of stop for just a second, and I wanted to go eye to eye with you for just a moment, and I kind of wanted to explain why we're going to do what we're going to do here. When they approached me about doing a webinar for auditing the FMEA, I was a little hesitant. I was a little hesitant because auditing the FMEA, depending on where you fall into the supply chain, where you fall in your organization, it really varies from person to person. So the first thing that I wanted to do is just kind of clear the field. We set this webinar up not as a technical guide to how it must be audited, but I wanted to show you the different opinions people have around auditing it. And I wanted to really set the stage that it really is a varying target. And so the first, say, half of this webinar is going to be about identifying who is asking for the audit and how their unique viewpoints on what an FMEA is dictate whether or not you're doing it correctly. So I did want to kind of cover that. Correct is a variable, subjective term. And so the first half of this is giving you a skill set and a framework when you go to audit the FMEA, whether it is design or process, to go, what am I trying to do? Who am I auditing on behalf of? And how do they view the FMEA through their contextual lens? Once we understand our viewer, once we understand our interested party, what we are going to give you then is 3 methods to flex your FMEA that will allow you to audit from a dynamic perspective and achieve those expectations from the interested party. So I wanted to bring that up because there is no binary. There is no perfect right. There is no perfect wrong. There is who's asking you to do it, how do they view it, and how do you leverage the skills that I'm going to give you in this webinar in order to do it more effectively from the various interested parties' viewpoint. So let's go ahead and take a look, that being said, at the 6 major bullets we're going to be going through. The first thing, we're going to introduce you to the idea of context in the FMEA. And we're going to show you how differing interested parties view the FMEA from different perspectives. And that's going to be important to you as the auditor, because it's going to ask, who are you auditing on behalf of? Now, the second thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to then look at the strategies of the FMEA to meet the needs of that viewer. And lastly, we're going to look at the great unifier, what I'm going to call performance. Okay, so these first 3 areas are 100% getting the context right in order to move into the next realm. Now, after that, we're going to give you 3 dynamic techniques. And when I use the term dynamic technique, these are techniques that you can use that flex depending on your needs for the audit. So again, there is no perfect technique. Anybody that tells you it's perfect, they're going to lie to you. There are a certain number of tools that I pull out of my toolbox when I do an FMEA audit that I want to share with you folks. So that's kind of last half of the seminar. So for those of you that may know me, you guys know kind of what I specialize in and probably have been on a webinar or 2 with me already. But for those that don't, a lot of my specialization these days refers to risk-based thinking and implementation, along with a focus on soft side skills. So when we look at FMEA, it definitely is an application, let's say an exercise in risk-based thinking, and the quality of event will 100% be based on how effectively you utilize it as an individual, within the team, and within the business. So anybody that tells you you can audit the FMEA without taking into effect the context or consideration the context of the business is again lying to you. So what I'd like to do here, I'd like to start with what FMEA is in context, because if we understand the area in which it exists, we'll understand how to set a proper goal. So when you think about the FMEA, the question that I bring to the table for those out there in webinar world is, what is the goal of auditing it? So you think about it, on Tuesday, you get asked to do an audit of the DFMEA or the PFMEA. The very first question you should ask is, what is the goal I am trying to achieve? And here's a goal setting tip. Goals are measurable and they have an endpoint. So when you look at auditing it, is the goal to do the audit? Is the goal to reduce the scrap of the PFMEA for certain stations using the audit? Is the goal doing an audit of the FMEA to troubleshoot warranty issues in the design? And so when I ask people, when you audit the FMEA, what are you trying to do with it? Notice over here on the left-hand side, it depends on who you ask, okay? And the reason why it depends on who you ask, and we're going to annotate this there so you can follow along. Every interested party, it really comes down to two things. The first thing it comes down to is their experience with it. So when they request an audit of the FMEA, how do they experience it? And secondly, what is their expectation for it? So in order to understand how to properly audit it, you have to understand their experience level they're coming with, and you also have to understand the expectation based on that experience. Now, for those that are IATF speakers, this is very commonly thought of as interested parties. What I'm going to do is, in the purpose of this seminar, we're going to look at 3 distinct interested parties, each with their own unique spin on what they expect out of the audit. The first group we're going to take a look at are the auditors, what I'll call the quality management system. So the auditors, the quality system, has an expectation. The second group that has a seat at the table are the practitioners. These are the designers in the event of a DFMEA, or the process engineers and the manufacturing organization in the event of a PFMEA. And so these people are distinctly different from the people who will be auditing it and trying to satisfy the scheme. Now, the third group that gets a seat at the table here are your organizational leaders. They have a very different view of the FMEA based on their experience, and they have some varying expectations. So if we understand this part, we can start looking at how these 3 parties change. Because what we're going to be talking about here, the parties interact when it comes down to the planning of the audit. So notice here, each party in the Venn diagram that we have here has a different responsibility. Now notice the responsibility that is given to management. Management has a financial responsibility. Management has a fiduciary responsibility to investors, to the organization itself, and so they see things a little differently. Now, on the other hand, down here in the lower right, we get practitioners. Practitioners have the need and the responsibility for the performance of their line. Think about it this way for my mechanical engineers in the room. If you build a manufacturing line that is supposed to run at 2% scrap and you run at 5% scrap, your line is going to be seen as less than. And so your need primarily is for the performance of that line to achieve the goals you set out when you went in to build a line in the first place. And the last party, the person that has the last seat at the table, so to speak, is the auditors. When you audit the FMEA, generally speaking, auditors are looking for compliance to the standard, compliance to a schedule. They're serving the needs of the quality management system. They don't have the same financial responsibility as management, and they don't have the same level of responsibility for the performance of the line or for the product that your practitioners do. So this is the dichotomy and the challenge that a lot of us deal with. And understanding the interested parties allows us to hit up these 3 bullets along the side. The 3 parties I just talked about usually have a significant amount of influence when it comes to the FMEA. Think about it this way. Does management cut the check for your FMEA audit? Absolutely they do. They're the ones that pay the bill. The auditors, The system, the standard, the scheme has a tremendous amount of influence, right? It's going to dictate that when your performance slows, you have to increase, say, your process audits and such. And the practitioners, they're going to have a tremendous amount of influence around how the audit is conducted, what stations you might look at, and overall, how it's performing. Now, because these three folks have different, say, levels of interest and different spheres of influence, it causes a situation within the auditing of the FMEA where the needs of one party can be diametrically opposed to the other entity. As an example, management says, hey, I'm willing to let you come onto the line and I'm willing to let you do 5 audits a year. Meanwhile, the scheme or the standard is dictating an increase in audits based on performance. Plus, we may see practitioners and auditors at different ends because what we may need for the scheme is a direct odds with how the practitioners can improve their product or process. So this is kind of how we look at it. And as an auditor, you have to understand that there were multiple interested parties at the table, and we have to find some sort of great unifier, right? Because the next question is, I understand that there are different parties. I understand that they have different views, different expectations. So what are we to do with this? And the reason why we approach this as a Venn diagram, if you are doing the right thing as an auditor, we want to hunt the areas in which we can get agreement. Now, notice here, I have down in the side here, I'm gonna put this in red, it's so important. Unless you can find this center point, the great unifier, you will never see a large enough organizational push to move the needle. Folks, I underline it because it is that important. I can tell you without a doubt, after 10 plus years as a consultant and after 20 years in industry, that the audit of the FMEA, in order to achieve any substantial result, has to have the initiative behind it, has to have the groundswell, it has to have some power. The audit without the gasoline, without the power, is simply an academic exercise. And so if we can identify the great unifier, the thing in the center of the Venn diagram that all the interested parties can agree on, now, if I write nonconformities around the FMEA, management is interested because it affects their financial bottom line. The practitioner is interested in it because it's going to increase their performance. And the auditors are going to be interested because they're chasing that conformance, let's say, to the scheme. So what we have to do as auditors is we have to identify the interested parties. We have to determine exactly how they see the FMEA. And then we need to strategize the audit so that we can hit all of those moving targets, let's say, with our activity. If you fail to find the center, you will have challenges because the initiative and the push will not be as unified or, let's say, as consistent as it needs to be. All right, so that's a little bit on the introductory information. What I'd like to do now, folks, because this is an interactive thing, I'd like to introduce a poll. And what the poll does for me is it helps me identify who's in the room so that I can target my messaging around some of the common challenges that you have relating to auditing the FMEA. So what I'm going to do here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to launch the poll. Now, for those of you that have been around with me for a while, you know when it comes to the poll, I stop when I get about 70% participation. So if you want the fun to stop, participate. The first question, what is your experience with the FMEA? Before I dig into the deep details, I want to know a little bit about where you are in your journey. The second question, how would you evaluate the effectiveness of your FMEA program? That is a subjective question. How do you want to evaluate the effectiveness of the current program? And lastly, are you aware that the severity, occurrence, and detection values are an admission of risk? Now we're going to talk a lot about that coming up. All right, we're starting to get some information coming in here. All right, 40% in climate, keep it on truck in there. All right, 54%, almost at that 70% mark. Guys may ask why I only look for 70%, because by the time we get to 70%, the needle doesn't move very much at that point. The distribution is largely set. All right, and we've crested that 70%. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to end the poll here directly. All right, let's go ahead and share out the results. So folks, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share the results with you here. The experience with the FMEA. We got some new folks in the room. We got some experienced folks in the room. So overall, I think I can have a deeper level conversation because we got some experienced practitioners. This one is really interesting here. A fair majority do not evaluate the effectiveness and just make sure that it's done. All right, fair enough. And this one here, it seems like we have an overwhelming majority here of people that understand that the S, O, and D values are actually an admission of risk. So this is good. That means in the practical example that I give you here in a moment, I don't really have to go through and I don't have to have that conversation at the same level. All right, let's take a look then how we go ahead and strategize the audit. So once we understand that there are different people at the party, right? They all see things a little bit differently. We have to then strategize our audit around the great unifier. So what I would encourage you to do, once you have your audit kind of, let's say, figured out in terms of what you're going to do, you want to think about things that all of the different parties can agree on that are important. And now the thing that I'm going to bring you back to time and time again is performance. Folks, performance is the great unifier. So performance from the scheme, performance from the financial perspective, and performance from the practitioner perspective are all the same. So we can talk about shalls from the scheme, we can talk about costs from management, but it all comes down to performance. So what I'd like to do here is I'd like to just kind of show you how the performance of an organization's FMEA kind of looks to those three individuals. So from the IATF's perspective, that of the auditor or that of the scheme, the IATF scheme forces the mitigation of risk in both design and process, right? The DFMEA and the PFMEA are traditionally ways that we mitigate risks to an acceptable level. It also talks about the use of preventative action. For most of you, the FMEA is one way that you prove out the preventative action part of your QMS through the application of FMEA. And it also talks about the achievement of customer-specific targets associated with metrics, like delivering quality. So again, if we focus around performance, we hit the scheme's need. The second thing, the practitioners get rewarded. So let's take a look how the practitioners get rewarded by meeting the performance targets set by the organization during program development. So if you're supposed to build a line that equates to 15 ppm, or you're supposed to build a product that has less than, say, 0.5% warranty, you need to strategize around that metric. So things like ppm, scrap rates, cycle time in the process side, things like accrual ratings, warranty performance from the design side. And lastly, management gets judged on things like expenses, revenue, accrual rates that they put into accounts. So management is still based around performance. And so what I want to show you here, if you're auditing the FMEA, the right answer is chasing the things that are causing the performance gaps. Now, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cover that again here. I'm going to stop so we go eye to eye on this one. Again, you audit the FMEA by chasing the issues that are causing the performance gaps. And you look to the performance metrics based on your interested parties' expectations and their experience with it. So I would be willing to bet you that out there in webinar world, probably an easy 30% of you, last time you audited the FMEA, didn't really prioritize based on performance, risk, or anything other than we just grabbed the FMEA and we went with the spray and pray approach and hope we hit something. And even if you didn't hit it, I'll tell you, I have 30% of the people that filled out that poll saying we don't look at the effectiveness of the FMEA audit, we look at its completion. So that's a big deal. Now, what I'm going to give you here, this is an example of a very simple FMEA. Now, let's keep it very easy. If you're looking at the FMEA, we're going to make this little simple fuel filler cap here. So what I want to kind of hit on here, just kind of explain this to some people that may not know. If we look at the S, O, and D values from any sort of FMEA, what we can look at is the SO and D is an admission of risk. Now, for those of you that have attended other webinars with me on the subject of FMEA, you know that this is something that I go through and I talk about every time I get the platform to do it. When I look at the FMEA, did I promise you with the severity of anything other than one that you would not be impacted? No. And as a matter of fact, right here, I told you this is going to be a regulatory issue for you. When I have an occurrence value of anything other than one, did I promise you that it would never, ever, ever happen? Absolutely not. I told you on a scale of 1 to 10, listen, to 6, it's probably braced for impact. And with the detection value of anything other than a perfect 1, did I promise you that I would always, always detect it, it would never escape? Absolutely not. So when you think about the FMEA, whether it's design or process, you should look at it from a standpoint of performance and reading the FMEA from a risk-based perspective as an admission of how much risk. In this case, this fuel filler cap's FMEA passes into the fuel system. Whole different thing here. Now, coming back to our 3 parties, does the IATF scheme probably want this handled? Can we largely agree that the scheme looks to high severity items as one of the primary drivers, let's say, for the things that you might work on? I would say in a general sense, absolutely. Now, the practitioner is experiencing a tremendous amount of occurrence, right? On a scale of 1 to 10, a 6 is not good. I guarantee you that scrap is going in the box every day at this level. So would the practitioner probably want this to stop? Absolutely. Their metrics are probably not stellar. Between a 6 and a 5, I'd be willing to bet you that the PPM is probably bad because not only is it happening, but it's getting out. Now, the last thing, does this issue cost management money? Absolutely, folks. One of the things you're going to hear me say later, scrap is calculated in the occurrence value. So even if it doesn't get out, guess what's going in the scrap bin? This is how when we go to audit the FMEA and we're unified around performance, we can identify the interested parties, in this case, the 3 we've been dealing with, and we can take the techniques that I'm going to show you here in a moment in order to actually go out and hunt those things. This is the value of it. So if we take a look at one more thing here, this is the great unifier. We've covered this. It's the basis of performance. So think about it this way. You've been tasked to do an FMEA audit on Tuesday, right? So you go out to the FMEA, and this is the type of chart that you get. Now, the white things, this is the overall plant PPM. The red thing, this is process-related PPM. The blue things, these are design-related PPM. So now let's take a look at this. If I have 3 different parties, here's how the 3 interested parties shift. The auditor sees PPM above target. The practitioner sees scrap, rework, and sort ongoing in the line or the design that they've created, right? And I know design doesn't have scrap or rework. So we could look at design as things like infant mortality or warranty rates. And how does management see this graph? The labor cost is high and the sorting costs are high. So folks, all three of these parties see things a little bit differently. Now, before we go too much further, I did want to give you one of my resources that I found valuable when I was coming up in industry. There's a book out there called The Solution Focus. And one of the lines, let's say, that was very impactful to me: change only happens in the eyes of those that experience it. Now, what does that mean, right? Because it sounds like something you should probably get in your fortune cookie at the restaurant. What this is saying, it depends on how you view it, whether or not it made a difference. And I'll give you an example. Let's say that I take your senior staff away to a retreat. We do new strategic objectives, new logos, new mission statements, all that jazz. For the handful of people that went through the 3 to 5 day activity with me, but did change happen for them? Absolutely. But for the rest of the people at the plant or at the office, did change happen for them? No. Why? Because they did not experience it. So the reason why I bring it up when it comes to auditing the FMEA, the graph that I just showed you is the same data that all three individuals were looking at, but it depends on how they view the world. So if you're going to audit the FMEA, you have to be aware of who is out there, what their expectations are based on their experience with it, and then to get some economy of scale when you audit, you need to find the center, right? You need to find the bullseye. So coming back to here, again, through performance, we've now found it. We found the center. All the audit focus should be focused around this area of high risk, the things that matter to all three individuals. And so in performing just one FMEA audit, you can serve multiple parties and leverage your improvement. Okay, now this one here, I included this specialty here for some of my supplier quality engineers that are tuning in. What about suppliers? Where do suppliers fit? So some of you may be engaging in supplier development where you will be approving FMEAs for your suppliers. And as part of supplier development, you may be required to add, let's say, and I use that term loosely, you may be required to add second-party audits to your supplier development program. So if you go to audit a supplier's FMEA, the same rules apply. What you're going to do as the customer, you're going to add your perspective as an interested party. And I want you to read the supplier's FMEA as an admission of risk. This is, and again, it's the third time, fourth time I've said it. This is the skill when it comes to auditing the FMEA that no one understands. In the supplier's FMEA, their unique combination of severity, occurrence, and detection will tell you where they are going to fail you as they're supplying their product to you. So as the customer, you're getting the roadmap to say, I know exactly what my risk is from supplier X. I know what the most common occurrence and detection ratings are for supplier X, and I know the things, if they get into my product, are going to cause catastrophic failure. When you review the FMEA and you go out to do an audit with your supplier, it is those things that should be the primary focus. That's how you read it. And so if you understand what the FMEA is telling you, that is one of the most important skills before I get into the tactical level that I can impart to you on how to make an improvement around your FMEA. Now, let's go ahead and let's do our second poll here. This is the second of two. And what we're going to do here, I need to know a little bit about who's in the room for the next section on tactics. And the reason why I need this, the questions are different because I need to know exactly what you're doing here. The first one, how close is your supplier auditing activity linked to performance? See how I phrased that up right before the poll? We're going to be talking a lot about auditing suppliers coming up in the tactical side. How do you look at what you consider high priority in your FMEA? And lastly, how do you prioritize your internal audits, followed by your supplier FMEA? The reason why we need to have this conversation, we're turning the corner from the strategic to the tactical. And if we don't have the conversation on these strategic topics, the tactics will never yield the desired performance. Hear me very clearly on that. That's the relationship between strategy and tactics. Strategy is how you plan. Tactics is how you achieve the plan. And so thus far in the first half, we're at 32 after the hour. We've been talking strategically, and this is going to finish framing out that part, because what I did not want to do during this is give you the tactics without the how to implement them, because that's not going to help you. All right, we're almost at 50%. All right, we're going to change some opinions here. Awesome. All right, 63%. We're about to end here. And the reason, folks, I share the results with you of the polls, you are unique but not different. So the challenges that you have today in your organization are not different than the challenges down the street. Yours might be a little bit unique because of the supplier or because of your product, but in reality, you're going to have the same challenges as somebody else. Let's go ahead and share this out. So folks, collectively in the world, your supplier auditing activity largely is somewhat linked to the supplier performance. I would highly recommend, if you say somewhat, I would definitely move that toward the very column. Item 2, which do you consider a higher priority in your FMEA? It's about 50-50. We're going to talk a little bit about this in tactics, but one of the things that I'm going to tell you early on, we'll go early on this, all that scrap is a PPM that got caught by detection. Now, your prioritization of internal audits, PPM, and scrap, that's good. At least you guys are prioritizing. Very happy with that. And lastly, in your supplier's FMEA, special characteristics takes a front row area. That was one of those choose many. So now, why is that important? I'm going to stop sharing here. The reason why I wanted to go through that with you is because notice when we start talking about supplier, you think the special characteristics are something that you may prioritize on because they have a direct impact into your product. This makes you one of those interested parties, and you see how your experience and your expectation affect the way that you would expect your suppliers to audit their FMEAs. So it is 100% a strategic discussion around how, or I should say why. Let's go with the why. Now, what I'd like to do, I'd like to turn the page, and I'd like to give you the 3 techniques that I bring out every time when I plan FMEAs. Let's go ahead and share this out. And when I say dynamic, we're talking about being flexible. We're able to talk about flexing to say, hey, it's going this way, it's performing this way. None of these are checklist type of auditing techniques, folks. Checklist auditing technique is for amateur hour, right? We're talking to professional auditors at this point. So we're talking dynamic auditing. The number one thing that I could tell you after 20 years, hunt the scrap, okay? Notice I kind of went a little bit early on this one because I knew it was coming up. Scrap is simply a PPM that got caught by the detection. So when I do this, a lot of people are PPM focused, and your PPM that escapes is simply a scrap that made it through the detection process. So if you want to have a high leverage solution to auditing, in this case, a PFMEA, focus on your scrap. Now, for the DFMEA folks, right? You're kind of in that same boat, let's say. What you're looking for is you're looking for your design for manufacturability issues. Now, the reason why I mention this, even in the case of 100% detection, because I know some of you out there are talking about 100% detection, non-standard process flows and accidents can release a scrap into the wild. So if you might have 100% detection and they clean out the scrap bin, that scrap may find its way back into your process or into the box through a non-standard flow. So one of the things that I focus on is I always hunt the scrap as part of my FMEA audit. Now, the other thing that I do, I typically will develop a characteristics matrix for the audit. Now, if you folks have never seen one of these, a characteristics matrix is a high leverage tool. And the reason why I say it is high leverage, you're going to take the characteristics along one side, you're going to take the steps in the process along the other side. And this allows you very clearly to see where the characteristics are formed. And my high value targets are the stations that form the most characteristics or the special characteristics. And notice what this characteristics matrix gives me. It also tells me, let's say that this feature for the outer diameter here is formed in OP30, but is used as a locating feature in some of these other operations. The reason why this is so powerful is because if characteristic 1 goes sideways, not only am I influencing that outer diameter, but I am now influencing everywhere that it's used as a locating feature. Because if the location's off, I won't have it correctly engraved, I won't have it correctly painted, and I won't have it correctly packaged. So even in an organization, if you do not have a characteristics matrix as part of your PPAP, this is a tool that I use when I go out to audit. And what I do with it is I start looking for the leverage in terms of the performance issues relating to my high value targets. This is one of those things that goes insanely well. And this is one of those areas where you can get a lot of good information with a minimal, let's say, amount of stations audited. So the characteristics matrix is one for auditors that I wish we taught more in internal auditing. Now, the third technique, one of the things I talk about, and you guys hit on it with the suppliers, follow the special characteristics. Now, what I have here, this may be the first time you've ever seen this, but for auditors, here is the flow and the way this goes. If we are making brake pads, the function from the DFMEA gives us the severity. This severity is then carried down to the drawing. Notice here the ability to distribute pressure is made possible through the thickness, profile, composition, and density. This is where the characteristics come in. Now what we do is we come in and we go to the process flow diagram and we identify the stations, back to that characteristics matrix, where those characteristics are shown. From there, we go to the PFMEA and we look for the product characteristic of density being there. And you see this little red diamond? See how the red diamond flows through all of these different steps? And when we have a product characteristic in the PFMEA, we can also look at the work elements like the press machine and identify process characteristics, which then also carry the same diamond as the product. This is the linkage from one to the other. And if I take this now to the last step, when I go to work instructions and forms, this is how it moves from the control plan over to the work instruction. When I look at the density, I sample 5 parts per hour, and I should see that on the sampling instruction for the inspection and the log sheet for the data collection form. So when we talk about dynamically or say flexing to address the FMEA, we're going to use the special characteristics. And by the way, for my design folks, this also works because guess what? This little corner of the world is yours. And if you start at the floor, you can backwards compatibility your way back to the drawing, back to the DFMEA. So hunt the special characteristics, utilize the characteristics matrix, and lastly, hunt the scrap, because the scrap is simply a PPM that got caught by your detection. And as awesome as your detection is, it will never, ever, ever be 100%. I know you think it will. It just doesn't quite work that way. All right, with that, Chris, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open up to you there, sir. You've got the floor.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thanks for sharing that, everyone. We do appreciate your time today. Before we get to our Q&A portion, and as you enter any more questions, just go over a few housekeeping items. For the recording, if you're looking for that, that will be emailed to you following our live event, following today's webinar. There are more resources available on our YouTube channel, Plexus International, related to FMEA auditing. Oh, thank you, Jeremy. So you can check out those videos. You might recognize the person in it. How to increase performance of your FMEA audits, 3 planning tools to help, and maybe 5 common mistakes you may be seeing. As Jeremy says, you are unique, but not different. Otherwise, Jeremy, I think we can get Q&A started. Let me grab the first one. So within the AIAG and VDA, this is from Alan, the AIAG and VDA uses HM, and L under AP, not SO and D, RPN. Are you referencing the new HML?
Okay, Chris. So let's clear that up, because this is a very common misconception. Notice that during my presentation, I'm leveraged SO and D, which still exist in the AIAG VDA. What does not exist in its old form is RPN. For those that are familiar with the old version, risk priority number was the multiplication of SO and D. RPN went away largely. So when we think about it, the SO and D values are still there, but Alan, in the AIAG VDA, the HM and L designation, those typically will be used to denote or to, let's say, choose. I'll use the term choose the HM or L level. So SO and D does still exist and still is read the exact same way. The piece that we largely discarded, notice I said largely because it gets a little gray, the piece we largely discarded was the RPN piece. SO and D still exists in the context of HM and L.
Just keeping on that thread, what do you recommend, Jeremy, for ensuring the values entered for SO and D are correct, as these are commonly too low regarding occurrence and detection?
All right, so that's an interesting conversation. So let's have this one. And I'm going to use the new AIAG VDA tables. So for everybody that was familiar with 4th edition, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the new table. In the new AIAG VDA format, we'll start with PFMEA. They give you actually 3 tables. There's one that I'm going to call behavioral or technical based. That's a new table. Then there is a PPM based table as an alternative. And then there was also a time based table. So the question you have is, how do you best say generate the occurrence values? In my world, and I'll tell you, this is just my process, so I'm in my own little corner. I look at the quality of data. So let's say that it's a new line. You do not have enough quality data to estimate a realistic PPM. So in the early phases of a project, I will use the behavioral and technical table. If it is an existing product that I have years of experience with and I can trust my scrap and my PPM data, I will switch to a PPM-based table. And I will tell you that your scrap data is a far better indicator than your PPM data, because when it comes to your customer, PPM gets a little bit gray. So I'll usually calculate my PPM off my scrap data, because remember, the question is not how often it got out. The question is how often it occurred. And then if I have, say, let's say I was an injection molder in my past life, when you hang a tool and you bang out 10,000 parts, if that tool was damaged, you'll never come back from that PPM. So what I tend to do is, if it's a tool-based condition like that, I'll use a time-based occurrence table? So the short answer is it depends on where you are in your journey and what your product is. But the great unifier, and this is the great unifier, however you represent it, it should provide a realistic risk profile. So it should perform in the field as it does on paper. However you get there is up to you. Now, when we talk about design FMEA, one of the challenges in design FMEA with occurrence is that many times it'll take years in the field to get warranty data back. And warranty data is ambiguous. It's like a magic corner of the dark room where you just throw money into it, right? So the surest indicator that I use as part of my design work in my DFMEAs is my DV battery testing data. So in my DV testing, if I find infant mortality in my design, that's a very real indicator if my tests are tightly correlated that I'm going to have that level when it hits the field in terms of occurrence. So that is my primary indicator. And as my product matures and the years go on, I then will update where applicable for realistic warranty data that comes back that I feel has a high correlation to the problem that I'm looking at. So Chris, those are my best pieces of advice for both P and D when it comes to occurrence values. As far as detection, folks, in the new AIAG VDA method, there's a new corporate and product line example column. Take a look at what the intent is from that detection column, and then put the test in there that your organization does that matches that criteria. That's the easiest way to do it. That way, every time you refer one of the tests that you do all the time, you get a high value of correlation and consistency in your FMEA. Chris?
Thanks, Jeremy. So if you are an automotive OEM with a 0 ppm expectation in your supplier quality manual, would you ever accept a process FMEA with an M or H action priority from your supplier?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'll tell you that I got out of industry before there was H and M, right? But there was still high RPN. Folks, the way that I do this, and this is a conceptual discussion, and this is a really good one for auditors. When a supplier gives me an FMEA, what they're doing is they're giving me the, let's say, risk that they pose in my product. This is actually something to be celebrated, because let's say that I choose a vendor that maybe is a low-cost vendor. They have a lot of manual checks. They have a lot of non-automated processes. They're not well capitalized. When you tell me this is the risk of my process sending you a part, it gives me the opportunity as the customer to protect my neck. That's huge. If you tell me that you're probably going to let me down, I will accept that PPM because maybe you are the low-cost vendor. And as we all know, right or wrong, indifferent, cost produces certain behaviors in organizations, right? So if you tell me that you're going to let me down, I can now put in hard tooling poke-yokes. I can put in automation on my side to detect where you failed me. But here's the reason I would accept it. If you lie to me and you drop those high value targets off and you reduce the HM or L with an attempt to get PPAP approved, now I can't protect myself. So this is huge. When your supplier passes a PFMEA to you, one, we have to accept the fact that certain organizations are undercapitalized, may not have the new whiz-bang detections and preventions and high quality tooling that we expect. And so what we want from the FMEA is an FMEA that performs in the field as it does on paper. One of the smartest guys I ever worked with in supplier quality, he was doing supplier quality in the 1970s when you were still out there with the Randy McNally maps in the middle of the Midwest. When he met me, he said, I expect all the quality that I can afford. And what he was saying in that one statement is he knew that some of his vendors were going to be undercapitalized. They were going to be doing more manual checks, more visual checks, and so his risk was higher. So he went in with the expectation, again, an interested party, and the FMEA is the expression of that that allows him then, when he goes back to his company, to go, because we chose vendor A, we need to protect ourselves in this way. Completely different mind shift. And when you're auditing a supplier's FMEA like that, that may be as good as it gets, because I think it's very common, Chris, that we have contractual obligations and contractual discussions. There's no such thing as a perfect. Good question.
Now, for these next few, let's pull the thread of design FMEA. If you do not have it, you do not have the design FMEA, only PFMEA, what's the starting point for technique number 3?
All right, this is good though. Okay, this is a good one. I came prepared for this. Again, this is Stump the Chump here. We're going to do this. All right, now on DFMEA, it is not uncommon that you do not have a DFMEA. So the starting point for technique number 3, and this is for my design folks, and then we'll talk process. If the designers did their job correctly, the critical, special, key, whatever you want to call it, the important characteristics of the print are the designer's intent for the product. So if I'm going to hunt the special characteristics, what I will look for is the special characteristics that are on the print. And then in the new AI AG VDA version, the PFMEA should have the end user effect in the failure effects column. As long as you have the effect on the design and you have the characteristic onto the symbology on the characteristic, you don't need the DFMEA. This comes back, Chris, to a discussion that we have because we've got a 2-hour specialty course on it. Every characteristic on your print is there to fulfill a function in the DFMEA. So there is no direct link from the D to the P except through the characteristic of print. So if it's on the print, the characteristic symbology should convey intent. So I start there, and then I'll look at in the PFMEA, that end user effect. Did they tell you if that characteristic goes sideways, what the effect on the design is? Chris, that's the linkage. So that's where we start on technique 3. That's a good question.
And I know you just answered this, but to reiterate, if you're hunting for scrap in PFMEA audits, what do you hunt for in a design FMEA audit?
When you're looking for scrap, think about the intent now. Scrap is the early warning sign, let's say, of your PPM getting out, right? The detection has failed you. So what I would look for in the DFMEA audit, I would look for those occurrence values and those infant mortality failures early in the DFMEA design validation test. So what I'd look for is those things that didn't go so well in the validation test. And I'd look to make sure that those things are tightly controlled and some of the design controls that we put in place are being carried over to the organizational knowledge for the next iteration. Or let's say that you had some DV testing that didn't go well. A part fell apart, let's say, because it wasn't robust enough, right? It rattled apart and that was the end of it. So if I'm doing a DFMEA audit, I see a highly correlated detection, but I see the occurrence value for that particular failure high, I'm going to dig into the engineering change notices and such that were created as a result of that DV test failure. And I'm going to make sure that the controls around that area are still in play. So was the tolerancing followed through? Was the material changed the way it should have been? The intent is the same as P. You're looking for the things that may not have gotten out. And in your DV testing, it didn't get out because of your engineering change request and your print revision. I need to make sure that that is bulletproof so that I'm not on the reactive side of warranty. Because again, all really warranty is let's say premature failure that your DV test didn't catch. So the same applies to scrap. Good question.
Now, what do you do if there is a one-to-many correlation, for example, semiconductors, between a special characteristics in design translates to many steps and tools in fab manufacturing to many correlation, not a one-to-one correlation?
Okay, that's an easy one. And semiconductors I'm familiar with, so you guys are the living, breathing embodiment of one-to-many. So with semiconductors, if there's a characteristic that's important to the design and it's a one-to-many, and it might be where you apply the masks, and it might be how you etch the traces, and there's 100 different ways that that goes sideways. What I will look for then is I will look for the areas that have either poor capabilities or those things that don't have really good automated detections. And I'll tell you, because in semiconductors, a lot of the things that you folks do have really good automated bulletproof detections, but I'll look at the things that maybe are more manual, because quite frankly, semiconductors is a setup dependent process largely. Once you put in that recipe, it kind of knows what to do, but it's those setup things. So I'm going to look for the manual issues in the one-to-many relationship, and I'm going to look to those areas of very poor capability, because very poor capability, again, is only held in-house by detection, right? So same thing applies. Good question.
Now, there's a question. My experiences with suppliers that certain ones tend to put very low risk numbers in their PFMEA just not to have something to act on. What do you advise for handling these types of cases?
All right, so this is supplier management here. Suppliers, and I'll tell you, suppliers are notorious for this, but I'm going to give them a pass on this. It's because as customers, we have beat them down to expect those low numbers in exchange for signing a PPAP. So right now we are living our own, say, result, our own effect. So if we have that with suppliers, the question is, and I think it's the aired question, there's nowhere in either fourth edition or let's say the AIEG VDA in which any level of SO&D does not require you to take action. Now, before I get confused, I want to make sure you don't misunderstand my words. When you talk about levels in which you don't take action, that is a holdover from a technique called threshold. And even before fourth edition FMEA, threshold was a methodology that was highly, let's say, not encouraged, right? As strongly as I can say, not allowed. The question in fourth edition changed to what are you working on? And now that is a contractual obligation between the supplier and the customer. So if the supplier is reducing values to the point where they don't have to act on something, the question is, from your customer specific requirements, what are you asking them to act on? Because your CSRs do take precedent. So if you said, hey, we're going to ask you to work on anything with the high action priority, again, coming back to AIG VDA, that's a customer specific requirement. Now, as a customer, before we go whole hog in and just start asking everybody to work on highs, realize that that could carry with it a tremendous amount of cost. So this is why I say it's contractual. So how would I deal with a supplier that continually drops their values? One, if I'm going to continue to use them, I would work with them to get values that were more representative. And I would take away the stigma of trying to get low. When I work in industry, and I'll tell you as a customer, I celebrate the fact that my customers give me higher than average risk profiles, because 6 months into the program, you know what I want to be able to do? I want you to look at your data and be able to reduce them for me. That means that we protected ourselves in those first 6 months and that our project was better than we thought. It's amateur hour if, when the project launches, you have to raise them up after 6 months. That means you either had no idea that was going on in your process or you were lying to me. And neither one of those is okay. So, Chris, that's my thought on that.
All right, we'll just take one to two more. I know we're coming up on time. Just a brief reminder of folks, as you do exit the webinar today, please do fill out our survey if you are able. And Jeremy, let's see. Doesn't PPM cover scrap, rework, and repair parts overall? So focusing on PPM may also reduce rework and repair costs?
Correct. In a large sense, PPM, if calculated correctly, does include the scrap and such that goes not right. Let's just call it things that don't go right. The reason why I focus on scrap is because as a subsection of PPM, so let's say that PPM is 732, I'm interested in the near misses, right? So think of it as scrap as subscribing to what are the near misses that almost got me, but didn't. Because much like near misses, if you keep standing in the line of fire, eventually there's going to be a hit. So I use scrap as a subsection because at 732 ppm, I can't possibly target all of the things And a lot of times with PPM that gets out, what you are doing is you are looking in the rear view mirror. And here's the thing, folks. I don't know how successfully you've been driving looking in the rearview mirror, but I would not recommend it. Looking in the rearview mirror doesn't get you where you want to be. So escaped PPM is kind of approaching an area of shoulda, coulda, woulda, whereas scrap is, this is something I have control over and it puts me in a position of power. So that's why.
Excellent. Last one, is it appropriate to ask for a summary of occurrence data to determine if their occurrence is correct?
Absolutely. If I'm working on a supplier and I'd say, how are you calculating your occurrence values? Absolutely. This is where, think about it this way, even in the AIAG VDA, the new handbook in step 6 optimization, in optimization, there's a new column, action taken with pointer to evidence. So this is key. If you're auditing this, guess what? That pointer to evidence, the evidence that bases if they drop the occurrence is there, the link to that study is present somewhere. So now you know it exists. Absolutely go hunt it. Because with suppliers, my common theme is I like you, but I don't trust you. So as we grow as a supplier customer relationship, I want to trust you, but initially I can't. All right, Chris, back to you.
All right. Thanks, folks. And thanks everyone who joined us today. Jeremy, we do appreciate you. And if you're looking for more information on FMEA auditing, ITF, or otherwise, check out plexusintl.com. We're on LinkedIn, YouTube, more, and we'll see you at the next one. Take care.